Brilliant. Anthony, just confirming that we've opened the meeting and everybody's in.
Yep, should be the case though.
Happy days. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us in what I'm sure is going to be a very exciting and informative session on the National Roadmap for Bidirectional EV Charging in Australia. So this roadmap has been co-funded by ARENA and Race for 2030 CRC and led by NX Consulting. So I know a bunch of you have been waiting for this piece to come out. I know I have, and we're really excited to get stuck into the detail with you all today. So I'd just like to start by recognising that I'm attending this webinar from the country of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I also recognise the traditional custodians of the countries in which you are all attending today and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person joining us today. So I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I also just want to take a minute to celebrate the diversity and ingenuity of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their cultures, which I actually think is particularly important today as we think about progressing the next wave of innovation in transport across Australia, connecting these countries. So before we get started, I'm going to run us through a couple of housekeeping items and the agenda. So number one, this webinar is going to be recorded and later published on ARENA's Knowledge Bank. So fantastic for anyone who's missed us today or wants to return to what we've discussed. But also, mind your P's and Q's. Don't do or say anything that you don't want to be saved for posterity. The webinar is also got a Q&A function, so you'll see in Teams there's both Q&A and chat. Please use the Q&A so that we can see what you're asking and people can upvote those questions. These will be addressed later on, so as you can see here, we're going to go through a few opening remarks, overview, and then we'll answer all your questions during the panel discussion Q&A. So in a second, I'm going to pass over to Darren Miller, who's the CEO of ARENA, followed by Bill Lilley, who's the CEO for Race for 2030, for some opening remarks. And then we're going to get into it with John Sibley on the content of the roadmap. So Darren, over to you first.
Great, thank you, Elle, and good morning, everybody. I see we have almost 300 people with us today, so that's just amazing. Thank you for all joining us. Look, before this webinar this morning, I was looking around online for a home battery to help store my excess solar energy, provide emergency power backup for my home and help save some money. And I found two options online. The first was a 13.5 kilowatt hour Powerwall 3, costing about $16,500 or around $1,200 per kilowatt hour. And I found another much larger battery from the same company, costing $900 per kilowatt hour, around 25% cheaper than the first battery I mentioned, and 4.5 times larger on a per kilowatt hour basis. And even more amazingly, it comes embedded in a free vehicle called a Model Y. Now, obviously, I'm joking around. We all know you can't just plug the Model Y or any EV for that matter into a wall charger and power your home the same way you can a stationary battery. But the good news is there's no technical reason this cannot or should not work in exactly the same way. Now, we all know, probably many of us on this call today are EV owners, and we all know that EVs are the future of road transport. We also know that as solar and wind penetration is increasing, we need to deploy significant amounts of storage capacity to firm up the variable renewable energy that is increasing throughout our grids. And it's clear that households right throughout Australia are looking for ways to save money on their energy bills, provide an opportunity to store more of their own solar energy, and become less reliant on the energy grid. And vehicle-to-grid technology and bidirectional charging more generally is a massive opportunity that can simultaneously address those challenges of cost, reliability, and emissions. Now, it's true that Australia is lagging international markets like the EU and the US in relation to V2G capable product suppliers in terms of competition and price as well. We have a small, complex and fragmented market that is plagued currently by an inability to coordinate properly, and this means that we're not getting what we need to support the local and international interest in V2G in Australia. And so we need to recognise these limitations and actively work together to agree on and then implement a single set of standards, regulations, and an approach to bidirectional charging so that we can reduce the confusion for equipment suppliers and increase the attractiveness of the Australian market. So today we're going to hear from the people who've developed the national roadmap for bidirectional EV charging. I'd like to acknowledge and thank the ARENA team, Elle, Alex, Adrian, Anthony, and others who are on this call. I'd like to acknowledge and thank Bill and the Race for 2030 team, and John, the ENX team of consultants who've worked on this report. This important piece of work tells us exactly what we need to do to make the dream of vehicle-to-grid a reality. And the good news, it's not rocket science. It's a simple task of collaboration and coordination. This bidirectional EV charging roadmap is a key resource that provides clear guidance to industry and government on the policy settings, strategy initiatives, and the technical standards needed to unlock bidirectional charging for Australia. We're really excited to get to work on implementing these recommendations and making bidirectional charging a reality for all of us. And with that, I'm going to hand to Bill Lilley, the CEO of Race for 2030, to provide some opening remarks. Thanks, Bill, and thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, Darren. Yeah, and I'll start by echoing my appreciation for the work that was done by ARENA, by our program Race, and by NX. It's exceptionally brilliant bit of work. We're very happy with the outcomes. Just worth noting that Race for 2030, we're a cooperative research centre at the Centre of Energy and Carbon Transformation. So we look to invest around $350 million of innovation money matched with industry to really change the landscape in which we sit. And as Darren rightly points out, we see the role of electric vehicles as a critical enabler for this renewable transition. And we all know that the future of transport is in electrification. So we have an entire research program that's run by Oliver Hill, who will join on panel session later today, that is looking to drive the growth and utilisation of electric vehicles by optimising our transport and our power sector simultaneously. This is work that we do in collaboration with industry, government and academia to really facilitate and drive this once-in-a-generation technology transition from internal combustion to electric vehicles. The national roadmap for bidirectional charging was initiated to identify different pathways of a commercial adoption. And this is very important, and I'll echo Darren's points about, we have the technology, we know that we can get there, and we need to look at how to implement this and to get it into the market in a commercial, sustainable way as fast as possible. This project undertook a substantial amount of consultation with a broad range of EV and EVSE stakeholders, including 7 automakers. And we followed this by a brilliant workshop of co-design with participants across industry and government, including automakers, distribution companies, charge point operators, hardware and software providers, peak bodies for consumers and their representatives, consultancies, market bodies, research institutions, and both state and federal governments. And our recommendations from the roadmap provide guidance to industry and government about the key role that these technologies have for unlocking this renewable future. This is a critical milestone, we believe, in setting this adoption pathway for V2G in Australia. It provides clear guidance to industry and government on these policy settings, strategy initiatives, and technical standards required to unlock bidirectional charging for Australia. As Darren said, we're looking to implement this to get it out. We recognise that everything still comes with challenges, and at Race, we're here to support and look to do further work that is required to really drive this key initiative into Australia. To build on that, what Darren talked to absolutely correctly, the incremental cost for EV batteries, is such a unique value proposition for this, and to implement and to make the most of the renewable future that Australia is driven predominantly through the adoption of consumer energy resources. So things like PV on your home. So we're very excited for today's panel session, very interested, to see people's reaction to this. And I'd also echo that last time I just looked there, more than 300 people joining. So obviously it's an area of great interest for Australia, and it's a great interest globally, quite frankly, in this transition. So thank you very much for the work that's been done, and very much looking forward to today's discussion from NX and from our panel. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bill and Darren. Some great words to start us off. So for anyone that still hasn't downloaded a copy of the bidirectional roadmap or isn't quite sure what they're doing on the call today, here is a link where you can access both the roadmap, the modelling report, and also the background paper. So now I'd like to pass across to John Sibley, who's Director and Principal Consultant at NX Consulting, to provide an overview of the roadmap, including the approach, outcomes, and recommendations for both government and industry. John, over to you.
Great, thanks Eloise, and thanks Darren and Bill. Anthony, unfortunately, the take control button is grayed out despite our best plans. So I'm wondering, should I just share locally, or would you like to click through?
You're more than welcome to share locally, John.
Okay, I'll do that. One moment. Okay, I'll just kind of maximize that. Can you see that okay? Great. Okay, great. So look, first of all, thank you to Race and Arena for supporting this work. I'd also like to shout out to my colleague Nina Fay, who's done a lot of work on this project. Wouter in Europe, who was our European lead, and the Vehicle Grid Integration Council in the US, who worked with us on this project, Endgame Economics, and ThinkPlace. So what I'm going to cover today, just give you a quick summary of the process that we went through and answer a few quick questions. Is bidirectional charging a real thing? What is the size of the prize, and how do we bring this opportunity forward in Australia? So as mentioned, it's been a pretty extensive process over the last 6 months. We've undertaken quite a substantial literature review, reviewing the outcomes of literally over 100 trials and knowledge sharing reports, engaged with a range of stakeholders who are EV industry supply chain participants and local stakeholders. And as mentioned, we had the National Roadmap Co-Design Workshop in November last year. In parallel to that, and I'll come back to why this is important later, we undertook some electricity market modelling with Endgame Economics to really look at what role vehicle to grid could play in our changing electricity supply mix. And that's important because as we went through the consultation process in green, our understanding of the opportunity changed. So in fact, the outcomes of the electricity market modelling are now seen quite conservative in hindsight, and we'll talk through that a little bit later. In terms of who we consulted, you can see we've got a pretty broad cross section. I'll just call out thank the vehicle OEMs who participated, and also the electricity network businesses who are very supportive of this technology and are actively working to engage with this opportunity. Let's go there. Some reason my slide isn't changing. Okay, there it is. So is bidirectional charging a real thing? So first of all, what is it? So probably the most common term is vehicle to grid. People often talk about vehicle to home or building and vehicle to load. Collectively, these things can be referred to as vehicle to X or BIDI, short for bidirectional charging. Through our consultations, we sort of converged on a definition of those concepts. So vehicle to grid is actually quite distinct from vehicle to home in our framing, which is that it's electrically coupled with the grid, so coupled to the AC 50 hertz frequency, and vehicle to home or building is electrically separated from the grid. A system can be both of those things, but only at different times. So you can be self-consuming, you can solar and exporting to the grid in vehicle to grid mode, and then if the grid goes down, you can switch to vehicle to home or building. In that case, you've got a grid forming inverter, which is setting the local frequency. Vehicle to load is quite relatively becoming more and more common these days, and so that's literally a GPO in the car or outside the car that you can plug in and power camping equipment or power tools or appliances in if the
Thanks to everybody on the Q&A. It looks like we've just lost John momentarily. I will see if we can get him to dial back in. There we go. He's just jumped off and rejoining momentarily. Thanks for all bearing with us. Very much enjoying the banter though. Tyson, who's trying to see how many of us have frozen. So that's highly entertaining. All right, while we're waiting for John to rejoin, it might be worth going a little bit off script, as it were, and heading to a couple of points that we did want to make later on in the panel session. So as many of you might be aware, the development of this roadmap was actually recognised by the DCCEEW roadmap as an other initiative under the technology workstream. So many of you will see some strong linkages between what we were saying in this bidirectional roadmap in the recommendations and what the CER roadmap is looking to achieve, as well as a couple of really strong linkages between the two. So in the panel session, we have actually invited Steve Refshauge, who is a director at the Federal DCCEEW, to join us on that panel. But Steve, are you able to come off mute and on camera? Because this might be a great opportunity for you to take a couple of minutes to just explain to the folk online what the DCCEEW CR roadmap is and how you are viewing the relationship between this bidirectional roadmap and the CER roadmap.
Thanks, Elle. Happy to do that. I actually have a couple of slides. I wasn't really preparing to do a presentation, but this might help guide the conversation a little bit. Can people see that screen? See my slides?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks. Mid last year, many of you, I think, will have seen that the National Consumer Energy Resources Roadmap was agreed by climate and energy ministers. The roadmap's available online, and all you need to do is search for CER roadmap, and it's the first hit. So the roadmap is set out in it's got 4 different work streams on this slide here. It sort of sets it all out for you. Before I go into the work streams, actually, the purpose of the roadmap is really to sort of set out a vision for how we're going to unlock the full potential of CER. There is a lot more potential in CER, particularly when we're talking about things like orchestration and the potential to enable new markets to support some of that interoperability. So there's a lot of potential, and it does touch on the future potential in vehicle to grid in particular. So I think there's some very strong linkages between this roadmap and the bidirectional roadmap. So the roadmap is set out in 4 work streams. There's a consumer stream, a technology stream, a market stream, and a power system operations stream. And if you go through the CER roadmap, you'll see there are elements that interact between the bidirectional roadmap and the CER roadmap. So there's a lot of linkage there. The work streams are set out in 14 different national reform priorities, and those are listed here. These aren't individual projects, they're projects within these, but work has commenced on all but 2 of those, and there's a timeline in the roadmap that sets out sort of the major milestones that we anticipate achieving over the life of the roadmap and its implementation plan. So that's sort of where the roadmap, what the roadmap sets out to achieve. In terms of how the bidirectional roadmap fits into this, so as Elle said, it is a priority project listed in the roadmap's implementation plan as a project to be delivered by other bodies, and that's exactly what has happened with ARENA and RACE commissioning this piece of work. And so now it's a matter of jurisdictions coming together to look at those recommendations in the bidirectional roadmap and considering that in a process of providing future advice to ministers. So it will form the work that the jurisdictions do together will be part of a much bigger sort of piece of work looking at the priorities that we have set out in the roadmap and what adjustments we might need to make. So again, that's just a process we have to go through to determine what advice we might provide to ministers in relation to those recommendations. So it's unfortunate this is a little bit out of sync. I think John's presentation might touch on some of the work streams in the roadmap. Happy to come back to this and answer any questions people might have in the panel session in relation to those linkages.
Thanks so much, Steve. I think that's some really useful context, and I'm sure that there's quite a few people that are going to have some more questions around those linkages and where to from here. So that's been fantastic. Thank you. And for anyone that does have questions, remember Q&A rather than the chat function. It appears we've got John back, so happy for John to pick up where he left off. John, I'm not going to let you present because history tells me that that's not going to end well for us all. So we'll have Anthony presenting, and we'll go from here.
Okay, I was just giving you a very lengthy explanation of the importance of 15118-20. So
how can we forget?
Apologies for that. Not sure what happened. So look, ultimately, I think I'm not sure exactly where it dropped off, but look, I'll just to say, vehicle to grid is the use case that everyone seems to be excited about amongst the supply chains. So that's what we've largely focused on, but it's not in any way to discount the other use cases there. We'll skip forward, please. So the commercial readiness was assessed for the different EV fleet types, so residential, business fleets, rental fleets, etc., and across different value streams on the across the top there. What we found was that we can consider vehicle to grid well demonstrated internationally, but there are a number of issues with integrating that in different contexts. For example, with heavy vehicles, we've got a 3 there that makes a lot of sense for school buses in the US, but in broader, like for haulers or freight vehicles, that there's significant challenges due to the duty cycle of those vehicles. So rigid trucks quite often have a suitable context to operate vehicle to grid, but haulers, for example, that might be a much longer term proposition, or it may not be a major feature of that particular fleet type. But otherwise, we can see that we've got good demonstrations of retail arbitrage, wholesale arbitrage, local network support, frequency control, and load balancing. Frequency control, in fact, we've got 250 millisecond response times demonstrated by BMW in a DC vehicle to grid context using 15118-20 dynamic mode. So really, we're talking about extremely fast, flexible resources here that can rival and compete with stationary battery storage. When we look at the the global opportunity size, we found amongst stakeholders that there's a very large focus on residential as a scalable opportunity. Residential vehicles are relatively easy to engage with from a vehicle to grid context. There are less challenges in terms of driver education and the physical infrastructure that can sometimes manifest at commercial fleet facilities. It seems there's an opportunity to leverage the experience of Australian residential customers with solar and stationary batteries. Car sharing is a huge thing with Sun to Wheel and We Drive Solar in Europe, but we've sort of discounted that slightly here because we just don't have at the moment a strong culture of car sharing in Australia relative to Europe. That said, with potentially autonomous vehicles and changes to vehicle ownership models, that could change. So we definitely don't want to discount that completely. Next slide, please. So this is where I was rambling about 15118, but look, just probably to say that that there is pretty much we think pretty much every make and model of electric vehicle on the market is physically capable of DC vehicle to grid, and you can see here a list of makes and models that have been announced to have that capability or have had third-party testing. And every time you test a new vehicle, it seems like, yeah, oh wow, I can do vehicle to grid. So the problem is the productization of those and the the release of those vehicles, of that capability by the automakers. So that's slow at the moment. It comes down to a whole range of factors such as incorporation of interoperability frameworks, the development of the value propositions, and I guess the overall product wrap for customers. Every end market will have a different local context, and automakers need to work through that very carefully. They're very concerned about brand reputation and consumer experience, and so that's a sort of a slow and steady approach that they're taking internationally. Renault's launched the Renault 5 E-Tech vehicle-to-grid product with the Mobility House in Europe. That's operating now, starting in France, going to Germany and UK. Nissan, under the banner of Nissan Energy, is releasing a CCS-based vehicle-to-grid product in the UK later this year. As a right-hand drive market, the UK, that product could be readily translatable into Australia, and Polestar has announced that the Polestar 3 will start supporting vehicle-to-grid later this year as well. So so really we're at very early stages in terms of productization, but the underlying technology, the standards exist for interoperability, the standards exist for grid connection, and it's really just about automakers deciding to release this capacity. Next slide, please. So there's that's supposed to pop up over the top, that image, but look, we did survey a bunch of installers through the Smart Energy Council, and what you would see behind that is that 20% of installers said that there's already very strong interest amongst their customer base. Around just under 20% said there's likely to be strong interest once the EVs become available, but nearly 60% said there's likely to be strong interest once the vehicle's available and the charger costs come down. Only I think one of the installers we surveyed said that it's unlikely to be strong interest. Consumers that are buying EVs are engaging with this when they're installing EV products. Many of them are starting to think about how this could be bi-directional in the future. And in fact, we've got a lot of feedback from supply chain participants saying that some EV owners are actually, or prospective EV owners are holding off that purchase decision because they want some assurance that they'll be able to do vehicle to grid in the future. There's a bit of fear of missing out happening with EV purchases. So overall, vehicle to grid is another reason for people to buy an EV. And that bodes well for competitive market dynamics driving vehicle to grid uptake, as well as EV sales. That's backed in by this NRMA survey, which just came out earlier this year, which said that nearly half of the Australians surveyed like the idea of using their vehicle as a home battery. Next slide, please. So one of the biggest trials internationally, Project Skyris. If anyone knows how to pronounce that correctly, please call me after the call. But look, it is the largest one internationally that we've uncovered, and there was a very strong focus on the consumer experience. It involved Nissan Leafs and with the CHAdeMO framework. One of the really important things is that consumers often go into vehicle to grid with some concerns and apprehension. They worry about battery warranty, that, will my vehicle be charged when I need it? Is someone else nefariously controlling my vehicle against my interest, right? What the experience shows from this trial and others is that the real world experience of people with these technologies alleviates those concerns to the extent that after they've finished the trial, most, actually 73%, say that it's important or very important that their next vehicle support vehicle to grid. So as when we think about this industry transition, the earlier we can deploy this across the economy, the earlier we'll start that process of consumer learning. People will be talking to their friends and family, and a lot of these concerns will start to evaporate. That's what we're seeing, and that's what we're targeting with this roadmap. Next slide, please. So at our co-design workshop, we started to formulate a sort of a vision based on all the evidence that we'd gathered through the background paper and the market modelling. And ultimately, there is stakeholders' view was that we should have quite a high degree of ambition, and in fact, it's feasible that by 2030 we could have 300,000 vehicle-to-grid capable EVs on the road in Australia. And we need to achieve that by removing barriers to market entry by automakers and EVSE manufacturers, and ensuring that tariffs and incentives enable consumers to access fair value of their investments. And so much of the roadmap recommendation can be considered in this light. And we'll go to the next slide. So what's the size of the prize? The next slide, please. So this is just a sort of a context piece, which really I think just illustrates the size of this opportunity. So in the ISP 2024, AEMO has estimated that we need 660 gigawatt hours of energy storage in the NEM by 2050. So that's to balance all the wind and solar in the system at that time. If we look at what the gross energy storage capacity of all the batteries in our EV fleet will be at that time, we're talking about more than three times that amount. So there's just this huge resource sitting there in people's driveways or in their offices and car parks that can be used for things other than just driving people around. We can leverage that investment, and it's something worth targeting. If we go to the next, click to the next one, and the next one. So what we see is we look at the growth of this opportunity over time. You can see that by the early 2030s, EVs will be the largest form of grid-connected storage. So very much eclipsing stationary batteries, starting to eclipse hydro. You can see the big blue blob there is Snowy 2.0. And certainly by 2050, in terms of gross capacity, it's very much dominating the physical storage in the market. Next slide, please. If we make some assumptions about what vehicle-to-grid uptake could be, we have looked at three different scenarios. So a slow and fast scenario there are the two blue lines. That's what we took into the electricity market modelling. If AEMO's ISP assumes some vehicle-to-grid uptake, and AEMO's projections are roughly in between those two blue lines. However, through the consultations, we got strong feedback that actually what we could see with vehicle-to-grid uptake could be much similar to what we've seen with solar. If you think about it, the actual hardware requirements and the capital cost requirements for vehicle-to-grid enablement are actually lower than solar. You don't need to put anything on your roof. You might need an inverter. You may not need an off-board inverter if it's AC vehicle-to-grid. And so it's possible to imagine a relatively seamless pathway for consumers enabling this technology without having to undertake significant capital works at their premises. So that green scenario really captures what we're calling very fast here, or it could also be called a solar equivalent uptake. And in fact, it's a bit shy of solar equivalent uptake. But certainly by the mid-2030s, we could have 6 gigawatts or 28 gigawatt hours of participating vehicle-to-grid capacity. That's not to say that that's available at any one point in time, but that's the capacity of the vehicles that have effectively enrolled in a vehicle-to-grid scheme. Next slide, please. So if you look at the vehicle availability, the story becomes a bit more complex. Obviously, vehicles are plugging in and plugging out throughout the day. Typically, and on the left, what we see is there's a very wide range of vehicle availability over time. The height of the wedge there is the difference between the capacity availability when everyone's plugged in, or when we think most people will be plugged in, versus when they're not plugged in. Typically, they're less plugged in during the day and they're more plugged in overnight. That's a default charging profile. We've based that on vehicle telemetry data, looking at people's charging behavior, road traffic information, and outcomes from various smart charging trials. And you can see the slow and fast scenarios map against the blue lines on the previous slide. if we think about changing people's plug-in behavior, we know that we're moving to a system which is going to have much higher intraday price spreads between the middle of the day and overnight. The market modelling is indicating, in fact, that we could move to a situation where it is not favourable to charge overnight, because effectively you'll be charging off large-scale batteries, which isn't necessarily the lowest cost option. The most economic thing is to shift as much charging as we can to the middle of the day when we'll have, could have effectively zero or negative market pricing. What then happens if you shift that charge into the day, and that could be because of different plug-in incentives. It could be autonomous vehicles or changes to vehicle ownership models, or the deployment of more charging infrastructure at our car parks and offices and other workplaces. You see that band tightening and firming up, in fact. So what the modelling shows is that reduces the total cost of bidirectional charging and improves the revenue potential. Next slide, please. So with endgame economics, we modelled a range of different scenarios. On the far left, which is the the best sort of net present value outcome for bidirectional charging, that incorporates fast uptake of vehicle to grid. It involves the day weighted charging profile that we talked about on the previous slide. And I think this is from a market scenario, which is our most likely scenario, which is slightly tilted towards solar generation as opposed to wind generation in the market. And what you can see, there's a number of value components that start to stack up. There are network benefits there in the green. There are wholesale market benefits in the blue. And there are costs involved in the deployment of smarter charging hardware that's capable of supporting bidirectional charging. So that's in the yellow there. And it all shakes out at a net present value of about $2.96 billion in that fast scenario. In the very fast scenario, it almost doubles. So it wasn't explicitly modelled, but if you think about the way that this would shake out, effectively, it would displace more large-scale battery capex, and actually encourages more solar generation because it provides a bit of a sink for that solar power, which props up the price somewhat. In all scenarios, it delivered a positive net present value. So in fact, actively supporting vehicle to grid is a no regrets activity. There's no case where we found that the costs of deploying the additional hardware to support bidirectional charging exceeded the benefits that we're likely to get from the network and the market value components. So we'll go to the next slide. And so this really, now we're going to go into talking about the roadmap recommendations and how we can activate this in Australia. If we go to the next slide, please. Really what we have to create is a range of end market conditions that make it attractive for automakers to release this capability in our market. We currently sit on a list of markets that automakers might consider for releasing this capability, and we're probably about 4 or 5 on that list at the moment. We have a lot of things going for us with our market design, with our consumer uptake of other consumer energy resources, and fairly supportive regulatory frameworks. But we're a relatively small market, and as mentioned previously, there's a perception of fragmentation, which means that we're not top of the list. It's going to be France, Germany, UK, US, and then potentially a couple of other markets, then Australia. What we've got to do is bump ourselves up that list. We've got to make it very compelling for automakers to release this capability in our market. So global conditions there. So we talked about the prioritization of this as a feature. So automakers are looking at a whole range of different features, upgrades to vehicle platforms that support longer range, infotainment systems, plug and charge. There's a whole bunch of things that automakers are doing and they're prioritizing those to deliver consumer value. They have to see vehicle to grid as one of the features that they want to release in that context. Globally, we need a competitive supply of charging equipment. We don't see that as a barrier at all. There are a number of EVC manufacturers working on this and working with automakers already. So there is a need to develop supportive warranty terms and communications frameworks to alleviate consumer concerns about battery health, battery degradations, and range anxiety and things like that. Those things are readily manageable. There is some degradation on balance. The research tends to show there is some additional degradation from vehicle to grid operation, but it is very marginal. And obviously, with improvements with battery technology, that's becoming less and less of an issue. Certainly, we think it's offset by the value that customers can get from greater utilization of that storage asset. And the integration testing, so by using ISO 15118 between the EV and the EV charger, industry is transitioning from 15118-2 to 15118-20. And in that change, they're developing, they're adopting the protocols to support bidirectional charging. Currently, -20 supports DC bidirectional charging in an interoperable sense, so plug and play interoperability between different makes of EVC and EVs, but it's not quite there yet for AC vehicle to grid charging. So we're seeing that's a process of internal product development and integration testing. In our market, we need government policy to let the global auto industry know that this is something we want and we're actively going to pursue. We've got an opportunity with the roadmap, provides a foundation for that. OEMs need to have confidence that there is a compelling consumer value proposition. That means things like tariff design, network tariff design. Are the services that customers provide with vehicle to grid, are they being effectively valued, and can that value be transferred through to consumers? We need to increase the addressable market relative to the market entry cost. That means reducing the cost of market entry and also demonstrating that this is a scalable opportunity, building on the other sort of supportive factors. There isn't really a problem with consumer understanding and willingness to engage with this technology, as we've discussed. That will happen somewhat organically, but there is an opportunity to support, to develop consistent messages and evidence base for those conversations. We're talking about point of sale at an EV dealership where the salesperson may not have any idea about this opportunity. There's a lot of upskilling that we need so consumers can make informed choices. Same with installers and other sort of sales channels. The Permissive National Grid Code, so AS4777.2, has been updated to support vehicle to grid. There's a number of chargers going through that certification process at the moment. That's not necessarily a problem, but there is a bit of friction and there is a bit of complexity. There's certainly a lack of transparency about what our local requirements are in Australia. And there's no place that you can point to whereby an automaker or someone developing a product for our market can in fact discern what our requirements are. They currently have to dig through a whole bunch of different service installation rules and grid connection contracts and rule changes, and it really is, there's an opportunity to bring this stuff together and make it much clearer for product developers. And finally, the processes for product homologation, so really setting out and supporting the process by which automakers and EVC OEMs can actually get tested to 4777. We will need facilities to do that. There's an opportunity to support that, to improve competition in our market, and also to if we look internationally, we see things like testables and plug fests and informal events where people can come together and debug products prior to going through that certification process. And that's going to be specific to our market because we have some very unique requirements with CSIPOS and solar backstop and all these things that they'll need to get their head around. Next slide, please. So the framework that the roadmap presents really breaks this down into 5 different action areas. So they're the coloured ones down the bottom, A to E. And with those, implementing the actions in each of those boxes, really the goal should be to unlock consumer access to this technology and consumer choice, let the market work, let products continue to evolve over time in a competitive market context. And through that, we will get improvement in the products, we'll get community uptake, and we'll start to realize the benefits, not just for the participating consumers, but for the market as a whole. The foundational layer there is the national policy commitment. The Australian government and Australian governments through the COAG Energy Council have an opportunity to signal this to international supply chains that this is something we're going to be looking for and we're going to be actively supporting. And then on top of that, there's a number of actions that we can undertake through a sort of a national strategy, which can actually create those end market conditions, which will drive both product availability and consumer uptake in an efficient way. So consumer value transfer primarily is about making sure that our long-run incentives frameworks support efficient uptake and operation of vehicle to grid. That means we need to think about tariff design in new ways, and we need to accelerate our tariff reform narrative. We also, in that box, we think there is a strong policy case for installation rebates to kickstart this industry. Vehicle to grid should not be dependent on rebates or subsidies in the long term. It very much should be able to stand on its own. However, if you think about it from an industry development lens, and you think about it in terms of starting to kickstart this so that it can build momentum across our community, that there are net benefits in offering incentives in that way. Smart grid maturity really comes down to addressing concerns about the complexity of our requirements across different NEM regions and in the West and Northern Territory, and providing a really clear resource that OEMs can build to. We have a number of the elements, a number of the pieces of the end state smart grid jigsaw puzzle coming into place now. We know there's going to be dynamic operating envelopes. We know there's going to be dynamic tariffs. We know that there's going to be solar backstop. All these things are now starting to come into place. If we can articulate that clearly, simply and clearly, and if we can actually well define the missing pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, that will provide a lot of confidence for people to build for our market. Interoperability and standards, we're still very much looking at legacy OCPP 1.6, which is very common across the market. We need to set a clear direction for OCPP 2.x, including 2.1, which is the interoperable framework for vehicle to grid. And ultimately supporting consumers, as we mentioned previously, with the getting information, quality information across industry into those sales channels, and also informing consumers about this opportunity. We think that installation rebates provide a vehicle to do that, as well as some further collaboration between the electricity industry and the automotive industry. Next slide, please. So this is, I won't go into this, but this is the roadmap, which kind of maps out all the recommendations over time. So you can go and get a sense of the order of those things. Next slide, please. So I think I'm a minute over time, but this is the last slide. So just catching up on my little break in the middle there. But look, so the key roadmap actions, national policy commitment that I mentioned, time-limited installation rebates, national electricity rule changes to enable dynamic tariffs and consistency for networks. So currently we're in a situation where dynamic tariffs are being trialled, such as through Project Edith. The Dairy Apatwig, the working group working on CCIP-Oz, is developing a dynamic pricing module for CCIP-Oz, which is a very exciting piece of work. In Europe, the European Commission has directed member states to make dynamic pricing available, not mandatory, but available to all consumers across the European Union. There's good reason for that. That effectively values vehicle to grid and other flexible resources. We should be looking at doing similar here. And currently, the national electricity rules actively dissuade networks from doing things in a nationally consistent way, and that's because the way that both the process happens of networks individually making CapEx proposals and they're assessing those doesn't allow for collaboration, or certainly doesn't support it. And also because a lot of the benefits that we're talking about here that arise through national consistency don't arise in the electricity market. They arise through greater product choices and lower costs for consumers when they're engaging with CER products and services, which are not part of the electricity market. So, two rule changes there. As mentioned, clear direction on interoperability, OCPP and 15118, as well as behind the meter interoperability, probably in the form of Modbus. So we are now talking about vehicle to grid coming in as a second or third consumer energy resource as a customer premises, potentially after solar and batteries. Those things need to be able to work together in a behind the meter context. The longer we delay getting that behind the meter interoperability sorted, the more consumers will be left with stranded assets and walled gardens and unable to effectively accommodate this new technology. And finally, as mentioned, there's a real opportunity to bring together what we know about our smart grid architecture requirements, develop a long-term objective, as well as communication products which effectively articulate our requirements to international supply chains. Thank you very much. That's it.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, John, and thanks for everybody bearing with us through the technical difficulties that we had at the start of the presentation. So we're now going to move on to about 30 minutes of Q&A, and I'd like to introduce John back into the panel, but also Oliver Hill, who is the program leader at Race for 2030 CRC, as well as welcoming back Steve Refshauge, who is a director at the Federal DCCEEW, who spoke to us earlier in this session about the linkages between the CER roadmap and the bidirectional roadmap that we're talking about today. So I could see that there was some lively and enthusiastic chats going on in the chat function. Hopefully, most of you have been able to find your way to the Q&A function for any burning questions. But essentially, how we're going to run this is in the Q&A function. If you've been able to find it, you've got an ability to upvote or like different comments. So, you know, in the spirit of a democracy, I'm going to go for the ones that have the most likes and upvotes first. So if you are interested in hearing an answer to a particular question, get busy on the Q&A function. And also, I will throw in that as a facilitator, I will choose to ask some of my questions as well along the way. So please forgive me for that. So I'll ask Ollie, John, and Steve if you can turn your cameras on so that everybody can see you. That would be fantastic. If there's a question that you desperately want to jump in for, do that. Otherwise, I'll start directing the questions. So the first one we've got here is from Tim Ryan, and his question is, has the working group looked at the digitisation of the distribution network / platform through virtual NIMIs such that we could plug our EV in anywhere so that our EV is virtually behind our physical meter irrespective of where it is? So John, I know in this work and in a bunch of other work you've been contemplating how we can make sort of transactions for EV customers easier when they charge. Are you able to talk to that?
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting question. Like in Europe, they've got new regulations now which support freight operators to take their electricity contracts with them. So when they charge at a freight charging terminal, they can actually have their own effectively retailer settle their electricity at predefined rates. That's important for the business case for freight in Europe. It's not something that we didn't go to that level of detail in this analysis. That would be one of the ways in which the results could play out, but we're not certainly reliant on that, or we didn't set out to specifically explore that. It's not critical to. I can see how it would be helpful, but it's not critical to the value realization from vehicle to grid.
Yeah, and I think what I'd add to that is there's been a lot of really interesting discussions on virtual NIMIs or roaming NIMIs in an arena, and I think what we're seeing is that's one solution that could be good for consumers, but there's a range of different technology innovations that could also make the charging experience and billing experience easier for consumers. So a live conversation, Tim, and one that we're very happy to continue having. All right, I might be a bit cheeky and jump in here with one of my own questions for Oliver Hill. So Oliver, I'm just wanting to understand from your perspective what RACE's biggest takeaway is from the bidirectional roadmap and what actions you'll be progressing over the next 12 months to support the continuation of this work.
Thanks, Eloise. And thanks, sorry, I was a bit late joining this there as well. So in terms of the takeaways, there's so many that we could really have an individual focus on. Unfortunately, Race to 2030 is only running to 2030, but to be honest, we could run this program for so many more years than that with all the bits and pieces that have come out of this excellent work. In particular, though, for me, it's actually been the collective interest and drive from stakeholders in the EV and EVSE space across Australia that makes me want to continue to do more work on this. So trying to bring together the different industry stakeholders within this network to push for further action to make desires known as an industry to government and to decision makers, I think is an exceptionally important thing to do. It's on us, I guess, to advocate for this sector. We're not going to get action from government unless we actually put forward positions in terms of what we believe the best solution is for, truly interoperable, truly optimized systems. So bringing that collective together has been a remarkable outcome out of this exercise, and I'd like to push further. I guess we could probably classify that under national policy direction, but that's probably the biggest thing to shine a light on out of this report. In terms of what RACE is doing next, we have a Race for Electric Vehicles research program, of which there's a number of other projects ongoing at the moment. But we do have a particular focus on vehicle to grid, not just the technical integration of vehicles to grid, but also how that plays a part in the experience for the consumer, how that plays a part in the wider transportation system. And so we're looking to develop more research projects in that space over the next year. I'll soon be coming together to release a bit more of kind of prospectus on what the Race for EVs research program is focusing on in 2025, and expecting that to include a number of exercises, including looking at trying to do more demonstrations of vehicle to grid here in Australia, acknowledging that we have some excellent demonstrations underway here already, but to truly test the boundaries of what we can do with vehicle to grid, we need to operate it in different settings. So that might be a public setting, it might be working across multiple distribution networks or with multiple OEMs. So there's all these things which we still have the ability to test. And a side benefit of testing in these situations is that there's strong international research suggesting that customers' participation in a trial or a form of research is actually one of the better ways to get them involved in purchasing an electric vehicle in the first place. So lots to do. I'll also share that RACE has submitted an application to join the International Energy Agency's Task 53 on the interoperability of bidirectional charging. So Task 53 is a 2-year working group program, which is being run by European and North American stakeholders to come together and essentially work on harmonized interoperability protocols. So there's interoperability protocol being worked out in Europe and North America, and they're working out how those two things are going to communicate with each other. It relates to what John said on ISO 15118-20. But essentially, this is the group which is collecting all the automakers, all the testing institutions, all the EVSE providers in Europe and North America to work through any potential gaps and bugs, which ISO 15118-20 might have, and work out how to resolve those so that we can have full implementation interoperability of EVs across multiple OEMs, across multiple distribution networks. So that's a bit of what's going on.
Thanks so much for that, Oliver. We'll go to our next question, which is, what is the latest from the OEMs in terms of warranty and use of the battery for V2X?
Yeah, so
Who would like to take that one, John? Yep.
maybe I'll just add a couple of things. So, I mean, interestingly, with the Nissan Leaf and Mitsubishi, there haven't been explicit warranty limitations on bidirectional charging, and so but they've been very much only developed through trials, through targeted trials. So we're yet to see largely what warranty terms for vehicle to grid or vehicle to home could be in Australia. What we've seen in the US, where vehicle to home is supported by the Cybertruck and the F-150, that it's very much limited to backup power contexts, that they don't support grid participation or even grid synchronization under their warranty terms. In Europe, with Volkswagen, we've seen limitations in terms of megawatt hour throughput per annum. So I believe it's 2 megawatt hours throughput for vehicle to grid purposes under the trial terms that Volkswagen's been developing over there. And we think that's probably a bit stingy, that 2 megawatt hours is probably not enough to get the sort of the value out of that capability. We'd probably like to see that doubled. So there's still a bit of work to do, still a bit of learning for the OEMs. Certainly the feedback from Nissan and others is that they've noticed negligible degradation of the battery through all the trials that they've been involved in. So there's a real case for OEMs to be quite liberal in those terms.
Thanks so much for that, John. I might go next to Tim Ryan's question. Tim, good, you've asked a lot of really good questions, so thank you for that. How do we address the bifurcation of consumers wanting to save using EVs as their buffer with vehicle to home versus potentially businesses wanting to use consumer EVs and CR more broadly for profit as an energy market player? I think Tim's also asked us to consider sort of the additional questions of, does one have a priority, and also around AEMO's need for control for system security purposes. So John, happy to hear from you, and then maybe we'll also hear from Steve if you've got some comments, given there's a consumer work stream in the roadmap.
Yeah, so I think some of these things are broader than just vehicle to grid. Now, they're really good questions and need to be addressed for CER as a whole. So I think what maybe Tim's referring to there is, this sort of a traditional VPP model where you get, a couple $100 a year benefit from the retailer, but they control your asset to manage their network price exposures and their wholesale market positions. So that's sort of the traditional VPP model, and certainly it's not particularly valuable for the consumer in most cases. But versus the other model, which is that you just send all the pricing signals to the consumer, they take on the risk and the price exposure, but they appoint an agent who then manages that on their behalf. So that's sort of the consumer agent model. We haven't tried to prescribe or take a bet each way in this. We've looked at the sort of the underlying value of vehicle to grid, but certainly what I would say is that interoperability is the key thing that enables consumers to actually make a choice, to not get locked into one service provider because at a point in time they thought it was a good idea, now they're locked in for the rest of that asset's life. So really interoperability, both in terms of the effectiveness and ability to communicate between the products, as well as non-prejudicial access to the capabilities of that product, in that, like if you've got a particular vehicle, they don't require you or advantage you if you have a particular charger. That will create the foundations by which consumers can choose the products and services, the level of risk they want to take on that best suits them.
Wonderful. Thanks for that, John. Steve, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think they're really good questions. I just also, I'll come to that in a moment, but just something I didn't really make clear before is that governments, not just the Commonwealth, but across the states and territories, we recognise the significant potential of vehicle to grid to support the transition, and we recognise that there are significant risks of inaction. So that's part of the reason that we've integrated into the CR roadmap. But even if vehicles don't engage with the grid, they're just doing vehicle to home, those households are still benefiting the grid. There are still significant benefits of that. We want to try and help unlock the additional benefits through vehicle to grid, but those households that don't want to participate, I don't see that as a significant problem. I think the using the battery as a home battery, as Darren alluded to at the beginning of this session, I think that's still a good thing. So supporting vehicle to grid is really a kind of a no regrets pathway, and indeed Minister Bowen, the Commonwealth Energy Minister, but other energy ministers have also indicated their support for vehicle to grid. So we're definitely on this journey. I might also just take this moment to point that I didn't really talk to the measures under the roadmap that go to vehicle to grid. There are several recommendations in there that do relate to it. I do note that there are probably about half of the recommendations don't directly relate to the interjurisdictional work, but half do. In terms of what those actions are that we're undertaking, those include things like developing an ecosystem of interoperability standards. And it does touch on the sorts of standards that John has flagged in his presentation and in the report. We would be proposing to consult or commence our consultation processes in Q2 this year on those standards, and we'd encourage people on the call to engage in those consultations. We're also needing to develop a regulatory framework to set and enforce those standards. We're working towards developing a distribution system market operator model, and we're undertaking measures to ensure adequate protections are in place as these new technologies and market offers emerge. We need to ensure that the same sort of protections that currently exist in the market apply to the new these new products. But coming back to the question, we're also doing work on building social license with consumers. So I think that the jurisdictions would all agree that's actually a really significant issue here around trying to ensure that consumers do engage with this technology, because there's huge potential here. And if they don't participate, if there is a trust issue, that will seriously, I think, impede the size of the prize. And so we do see that as a very significant thing to tap into. And John's the data in John's report, his findings around people's interest shows that there is great potential. Consumers want to, but whether they actually will, we need to ensure that consumers are well informed and trust the tech. Sort of going back to this question around vehicle to grid versus vehicle to home, it does come, I think the trust issue does come into that, but also, as I said before, there are benefits both ways. We want people to start tapping into the tech, and as we develop, or as markets develop and opportunities develop for consumers to benefit more by participating in vehicle to grid, we would hope that that consumers see the value in that. And of course, if the aggregators, retailers, whoever are offering these products do not pass through an adequate reward to the consumer, if that price signal is too weak, of course that will be a missed opportunity for them. So I've got some confidence that it will work out well for consumers.
Thanks so much for that, Steve. We'll now just go on to Roger's question. So it was mentioned that there is an assumption that the capex for V2G enabled charges will be low, but at the moment they are around 10K, quoting the Wallbox. What assumptions go into the modelling about the capex for the EVSE? Now, I have pointed Roger and whoever else is having a look at the Q&A towards the modelling appendix that we've got, John, but I suspect that this points to the V2G installed costs at the back of that appendix.
Yeah, that's right. So I think there's two aspects to this. Obviously, the prices are very high at the moment for DC offboard chargers. We're talking about products which are typically like handmade. They're not at scale production yet. So and they're homologating for our market with a very low addressable market size in terms of, for CHAdeMO chargers with the Wallbox or with some of the new products coming to market. So we do expect that they'll start off high, and we've assumed they'll start off high, but with market competition and installation rebates, that we think they'll come down quite quickly. We've looked at the underlying physical hardware costs, which are basically equivalent to a hybrid inverter for a DC offboard charger. So we think we can get that down to about $3,500 or so in a competitive market. But also we think that we've assumed over time there will be a shift from DC bidirectional charging to AC bidirectional charging, and whereby the actual power converter can be rather than in batches of thousands, they can be manufactured at scale of hundreds of thousands in the actual plant that's building the car, or sourced, I should say, for that by the automaker. So all the feedback we got from stakeholders is that the costs could come down very rapidly, and we have assumed a cost reduction path for that technology.
Thanks so much, John. I can see Jackson's put the picture in the chat for anyone that isn't following the Q&A. So that's also very, very helpful. Our next question comes from Benjamin, and that is, how can Australian industry support the V2G transition? So thanks for the question, Benjamin. And I might be just a little bit cheeky and jump in here and have a quick spiel about how ARENA's thinking about supporting the V2G transition. So ARENA obviously is the innovation industry, and we're looking to provide funding as well as knowledge sharing to support the supply and commerciality of renewables in Australia. So at the end of last year, many of you may have come along to a webinar where we announced the new focus areas under ARENA's Driving the Nation program, which are on supporting heavy vehicles, hubs, as well as innovation. And for the group here today, that innovation focus area is key, because that's where we've described how we want to support vehicle to grid trials amongst a range of other innovation prospects for battery electric vehicles. So we've already got a project with Amber Electric that's looking to unpack a pathway to V2G as well as smart charging. But I think the message from me today is we're very much open for business, where there are groups with innovative or novel projects that are looking to break down the barriers that we've looked at in the bidirectional roadmap in actually making the V2G proposition commercial. With that, I might ask Alex Grant, who doesn't have a his shiny face up on this Q&A panel, but is the lead of the transport area at ARENA, if he wants to say anything else on that, and then we'll throw to the rest of the panel.
Thanks, Elle. Maybe just a reflection. This group we've got on the webinar is very much the target audience who have been thinking about this problem for many years. It was telling, the slide that John froze on, that there've been a bunch of trials done to date, and really we're looking to support building on the shoulder of those giants who've done the work to date and get this to be a commercial proposition. So for anyone out there who has been thinking about the concepts but looking for that funding support, ARENA is there for that piece. We do appreciate that for many, particularly startups or those who are just busy cracking on with the challenge of making EVs proliferated, that it takes time and effort, but we'd love to chat and just understand what you're doing. And hopefully this funding envelope through Driving the Nation will be one way to unpick that.
Thanks, Alex. Maybe just opening up to the rest of the panel. Ollie, John, Steve, anything to add?
Yeah, I think just briefly, I mean, there's a lot of, we're talking about millions of installations, right? So we're talking about a large, it's going to need to be supported by a workforce, and installation, operations, management. We've already got global leadership in a number of areas, such as the orchestration software and CR optimization tools that Australian businesses are exporting internationally on that software control layer. We are very much at the front end internationally. And when you think about how our smart grid architecture is evolving, we're a bit of a sort of a canary in the coal mine in terms of high CR, high solar penetration. So the kinds of solutions that we develop to optimize EV charging and vehicle to grid in that high solar environment certainly have export potential. So I'd say, yeah, it's in the installation, maintenance, as well as the software layer that offer the greatest economic opportunities.
If we've got time, Eloise, I wanted to just jump in briefly on the terminology. There's been a few questions on terminology, which I just wanted to point out and maybe get John to relay, I think, what he's told both of us a couple of times around some of the international terminology that gets used. It was pointed out to me the other day that we sometimes in our communications have used V2G and bidirectional or BiDi interchangeably. I have to apologize for that. Australians, we love our acronyms. BiDi is just bidirectional, but I'm fully supportive of using that as bidirectional as a more general term to describe this. I might let John speak a bit more to the specific terms, but my understanding is that internationally, it's more just you're referring to bidirectional charging and the V2G, V2H, etc. They're components. It's aspects of what you can have as a service, but the electrons flowing both ways is what needs to be concentrated on when actually describing what we're trying to achieve here.
Yeah, so bidirectional is just a umbrella term for the different kinds of modes or configurations. A lot of people use V2X, and in our report for ARENA a couple of years ago, we used the term V2X. The problem with V2X is it actually already has a meaning involving vehicle-to-vehicle communication and things like that, which are not energy related. So we've sort of pulled back on using that V2X term and are now using bidirectional charging as the umbrella. It's commonly used internationally. So I think it's just a matter of getting on board.
And I think specifically in the reports that we've released, you'd notice that the modelling report refers to V2G, and that is quite specifically the V2G use case under the bidirectional umbrella. So the language that we've been using today and maybe in some of the communications has been a bit loose, but in the actual reports, being the roadmap, the background paper, and the modelling, all of those terms being BiDi, V2G, V2H, etc., have all been used quite deliberately. Okay. With that, I think we have time for one more question. All right, this one's from Steve Humphreys. So there seems to be a focus on communication standards / protocols. Has there been much work on the electrical performance standards for EVSE and energy efficiency standards, also connection standards and managing and monitoring of cyber events? So there was quite a bit of work in the recommendations around smart grid architecture as well as standards and protocols. I wonder, John, are you happy to take us out with this one on how we've been thinking about this?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. Obviously the grid performance requirements are largely specified in AS4 777.2, so they will automatically apply to vehicle to grid, not to vehicle to home. The cyber requirements, we've called that out as being important in the background paper, but we have not dived into that. That is a broader issue for CER, system security and resilience. That I understand there's a if there isn't, there should be work between AEMO and the Commonwealth on that. I mean, interestingly, what we're seeing obviously is the generators get lumped with all the grid performance standards, and the loads sort of get a bit of a free ride. But what we're seeing is that's starting to change. So in Europe, there's a move to actually apply the equivalent grid performance standards that would for generators, for inverter-based generating systems, to actually inverter-based loads like EV unidirectional charging or bidirectional charging in charge mode. So, so this is something which is evolving. What we would say is that Australia, this is not an area where Australia needs to lead. That we can very much lean into the good work that's being done in Europe and the US on that front. But yeah, it's broader than just bidirectional EV charging. This is something which is, you know, very important for what's happening to our power system right across the board with greater inverter-based generation and CER participation. There was a study done which we undertook for AEMO last year called EV Technical Standards for Grid Operation. That really goes through quite systematically all the power system security risks associated with a very high EV penetration. So I'd refer people to that, and we haven't sought to duplicate that work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, John. With only 2 minutes to go, we might leave it there. But if you do have any, burning questions, exciting projects, exciting propositions, please feel free to reach out to anybody on the call today. Be happy to answer your questions in person. With that, just want to thank everybody for taking the time with us this morning to have a listen to what's new with the National Roadmap for Bidirectional EV Charging. I'd like to encourage you to fill out this feedback survey, which has just popped up here. There's a link there which will come out with the slides or the QR code. This is really important for ARENA in particular. It helps us understand the types of events and information that you will find useful so we can continue running panel sessions like this. Following this event, we'll send an email out to all attendees containing the slides as well as the link to the report, which will be sent out later today or tomorrow. And the webinar recording, when ready, will also be put up on the website in the coming weeks so that you can share this event with others who have missed out or re-listen to any of the content yourself. So thank you to everyone on behalf of ARENA, RACE, NX and DCCEEW and the whole panel. Thank you to all. Cheers.